Welcome to the world of epic tales, where myth and history dance under the same moon. Tonight, we begin our journey into the heart of the Trojan War. Now, settle in, get comfortable, perhaps wrap yourself in that favorite blanket, find your most cherished armchair. Let your shoulders relax, just a little. That's it. Imagine the day's worries gently slipping away, like pebbles tossed into a calm sea. I'm curious though, where are you tuning in from tonight? And what time is it for you? Is it a peaceful evening, or perhaps a bright morning in your own perfectly timed existence? No matter the hour, it's good to have you here. If you find yourself enjoying these deep dives into the past, consider subscribing to this channel so you don't miss a single moment. And now, as the fire crackles low and the shadows lengthen, let us travel back, far back, to a time when kings and heroes walked the earth, preparing for a conflict that would echo through centuries. The salt spray kissed the faces of the young men as their galley pitched against the gentle swells. Ilara, a scribe whose hands were more accustomed to the smooth feel of papyrus than the rough weave of sailcloth, gripped the wooden railing. The scent of the sea, sharp and invigorating, mingled with the less welcome aroma of stale sweat from the hundreds of bodies packed onto the ship. She watched Prince Paris, his brow furrowed in concentration, as he barked orders to the helmsman, his voice carrying over the steady creak of the oars. Days ago, she had been tidying his chambers after a lavish feast, the air still thick with the lingering scent of roasted boar and honeyed wine, and had found it. The object sat nestled amongst discarded lyre strings and a half-eaten pomegranate. It was an apple, carved with an artistry that spoke of deep skill, its surface so polished it seemed to hold a captured light. Ilara had admired its perfection, its vibrant hues of red and gold, yet a faint sense of foreboding had pricked at her. She remembered the hushed whispers that had followed the prince that very evening, the king's own shadowed expression as he gazed upon his son. Something of immense weight had been decided in the opulent halls, a choice made by a prince that felt, even then, larger than any single man. Meanwhile, across the sea, in the sun-drenched halls of Sparta, King Menelaus shared a quiet moment with his wife, Helen. Ilara had heard tales of her beauty, whispers that traveled faster than any ship. Menelaus, a man whose voice was usually a deep rumble of authority, spoke with a gentle affection as he watched her adjust a golden clasp in her hair. Their conversation was about the upcoming festival, the joyous anticipation of sacrifices and feasting that would soon fill their palace. Yet, even in their shared laughter, a subtle tension seemed to weave itself into the air, a premonition of disruption that only later, looking back, would Ilara understand as the first tremor of a coming storm. Back in Troy, the elder counselors had gathered in the great hall, their voices a low murmur that Ilara, as she cleared away the last of the serving platters, strained to understand. They spoke of alliances, of past grievances, and the delicate balance of power that held their kingdom secure. Their faces, usually etched with thoughtful consideration, now showed a flicker of something akin to unease. One aged advisor, his beard white as snow, gestured emphatically, his words about respecting certain traditions drawing a stern nod from the king. It was clear to Ilara, even as a mere scribe, that the prince's recent journey had stirred more than just diplomatic currents. The prince, Paris, had returned from his travels bearing not just gifts, but a bride of legendary beauty. Ilara watched as Helen, her presence commanding an almost reverent silence, walked through the palace courtyards, her gaze sweeping over the intricate frescoes and the vibrant gardens. The young scribe felt a pang of curiosity, wondering if the prince truly understood the magnitude of what he had brought into their lives. The delicate peace their city enjoyed, a peace Ilara had only known, felt suddenly as fragile as the gilded porcelain cups that graced the royal table. The prince himself seemed almost oblivious to the quiet anxiety that seemed to settle over the court like a fine dust. He spoke animatedly of the sights he had seen, the wonders of foreign lands, his eyes alight with a youthful enthusiasm that few could match. Ilara noticed him tracing the lines of the carved apple, still tucked away on a table in his study, as if seeking some hidden meaning within its polished curves. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, yet it stayed with her, a silent question mark hanging in the air. The whispers amongst the royal guard were of a different nature. They spoke of the ships that had docked at their harbor, ships bearing men from distant lands, men whose armor glinted with a foreign craftsmanship. Ilara overheard a seasoned captain grimly remarking on the sheer number of vessels, a fleet that seemed to stretch as far as the eye could see. He mentioned a shared outrage, a grievance that had been stirred, prompting many separate kingdoms to send their warriors. This, she realized, was not just about a prince's dalliance. The king, Priam, a man whose years had softened his features but not dimmed the keenness of his gaze, convened an urgent council. Ilara watched from her usual place, a shadow in the corner, as the gathered princes and advisors discussed the implications of Paris's actions. The air in the council chamber was thick with tension, the scent of burning cedar from an oil lamp doing little to dispel it. The elders' council, previously dismissed by some as overly cautious, now held a weight of prescience. The fragility Ilara had sensed was beginning to manifest. A knot of unease tightened in Ilara's stomach as she observed the interaction between Paris and Helen. She saw the prince offer her a delicate necklace, its gold chain shimmering. Helen accepted it with a smile, but her eyes, Ilara noted, seemed to hold a flicker of something distant, a wistful glance towards the sea. It was as if a shadow had fallen over her radiant beauty, a hint that her new home, for all its splendor, was not entirely of her own choosing. The weight of this observation settled heavily upon the scribe. Later, as Ilara carefully packed away the royal scribe's tools for the night, her gaze fell once more upon the carved apple. She picked it up, its cool surface smooth against her palm. The intricate carvings seemed to writhe in the fading light, hinting at a story of choice and consequence far greater than she could fully comprehend. It was a simple object, yet it held the unspoken promise of immense change, a silent testament to the power of a single decision to ripple outwards, touching the lives of thousands and altering the course of kingdoms. Around the prince's chambers, the familiar sounds of servants tidying and the distant clang of armor continued their ancient rhythm. The salt spray stung the recruit's eyes, a harsh welcome from the churning sea. He blinked, trying to focus on the grizzled sailor beside him, whose weathered hands expertly coiled a thick rope. Around them, the harbor buzzed with a purposeful clamor, a sound that had grown steadily over weeks, transforming quiet bays into vast temporary cities of wood and canvas. This relentless activity, the constant hammering and shouted commands echoing across the water, had drawn men from every corner of their lands, all responding to a single urgent summons. The sailor, a man named Lycos, whose face was a roadmap of forgotten voyages, grunted as he secured the knot. "Best get used to it, lad," he rasped, his voice rough like dried seagrass. This isn't a pleasure cruise. The kings have spoken, and a debt must be paid. He gestured with his chin towards a fleet of vessels, hundreds of sleek, deep-hulled ships being fitted with towering masts and immense sails, their timbers creaking under the weight of preparation. Each one represented a journey, a commitment of resources, and a shared purpose that few dared to question. The recruit, barely old enough to shave, nodded, his grip tightening on the bronze spear he carried. He'd never seen so many ships, or so many men gathered with such singular intent. The sheer scale of the undertaking was enough to make his stomach clench, a feeling he tried to hide from Lycos. He remembered the king's pronouncements back home, the tales of insult and broken trust that had ignited a shared anger, a desire for recompense that now manifested in this colossal assembly of men and material. Lycos noticed the young man's unease. "Aye, it's a sight," he admitted, his gaze sweeping across the expanse of the bay. "But what else are we to do? Our honor demands it. Our alliance calls for it." He pointed towards the east, where the hazy line of the distant Asian shore was barely visible. That's where their destination lay, a place of fabled wealth and a grievance that had brought them all together, a common purpose forged from a personal slight that had resonated through every household. The preparations were a symphony of organized chaos. Hundreds of men, like ants swarming over a fallen tree, worked tirelessly to load provisions onto the ships. Baskets piled high with grain, amphorae filled with wine and oil, and chests overflowing with bronze weaponry were hoisted aboard, each item crucial for the long journey and the anticipated conflict. The air, carrying the tang of the sea, was also alive with the sharp scent of freshly cut wood and the dry rustle of woven sails being unfurled and checked. Lycos moved with an economy of motion, having performed these tasks more times than he could easily count, each movement a testament to years spent under the vast open sky. He saw the young recruit falter slightly, his brow furrowed as he wrestled with a particularly heavy coil of rope. "Lean into it, boy," Lycos called, his voice carrying easily over the din. "The hull needs to be secure, or the sea will claim her before we even see our enemy." He understood that their collective strength, however vast, depended on the smallest detail being meticulously attended to by each individual. The urgency of the situation had pulled men away from their farms, their workshops, and their families, unifying them under the banners of their respective kings. Lycos remembered the initial disbelief when the call to arms had first been sounded, but as the weeks passed, the shared outrage and the promise of glory had solidified their resolve. Now, standing on the deck of the ship, he felt a familiar sensation, the slight, subtle roll of the hull as it settled deeper into the water, a promise of the immense journey that awaited them. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the busy docks, Lycos and the recruit finished their task. They stepped back, admiring the taut lines of the rigging and the neatly furled sails, a small but vital contribution to the grand endeavor. The sheer number of vessels filling the bay and stretching out towards the open sea was a testament to the combined might of their peoples, a force poised to depart for distant shores, driven by a shared grievance that had now set the world in motion. The air carried the distant cries of gulls, a familiar sound that seemed to both mourn and celebrate this moment of departure. The recruit, His initial nervousness, now tempered with a grudging sense of purpose, watched as more men arrived with their gear, their faces a mixture of grim determination and quiet anticipation. He wondered what lay ahead, beyond the shimmering horizon, and if the old ways of peace would ever truly be the same after such a gathering. The organized movement of men and material was a clear display of how a unified purpose, born from a perceived injustice, could mobilize entire societies. Lycos, scanning the horizon with eyes that had seen many sunrises and sunsets, felt a stirring within him, the same feeling that had accompanied him on countless voyages, a mix of apprehension and the undeniable pull of the unknown, a testament to the human spirit's capacity for both unity and conflict. The salt spray lingered on their faces as Lycos and the recruit watched the final preparations, the vast fleet a formidable sight against the darkening sky. The distant horizon, once a familiar curve of sea and sky, now bore a dark, unsettling line that grew with each passing hour. Toros, a seasoned border guard whose weathered skin told tales of countless dawns spent watching the waves, felt a tremor pass through the sandy bluff where he stood. It wasn't the earth itself that shook, but the sheer, impossible weight of what approached. He could hear it too, a low hum carried on the breeze, a sound unlike the familiar crash of surf or the cries of gulls. Thousands of sails, a veritable forest of white against the blue, were converging, each one a testament to a unified purpose that chilled him more than any winter wind. This vast assembly, so far beyond anything he had ever witnessed, felt less like an army and more like a force of nature itself, overwhelming and inexorable. He signaled to his comrades, their faces grim masks etched with the same dawning dread. Old Helen, who had served on the walls since his youth, gripped his spear tighter, his knuckles white against the polished bronze. They exchanged few words, for what could words convey against such a spectacle? The sheer scale of the incoming fleet dwarfed their small outpost, a stark reminder of their isolation against this tidal wave of humanity. Toros watched as the foremost vessels began to anchor some distance from the shore, their dark hulls like predatory beasts settling in for a long wait, and a cold knot tightened in his stomach. Meanwhile, across the shimmering water, the Achaean scout Lycon felt the familiar grit of coarse sand shift beneath his sandals as he probed the shoreline, seeking a suitable place for the landing craft to disgorge their warriors. The rhythmic pulse of the waves against the coast provided a constant, unnerving backdrop to the rising tension in his chest. He kept his gaze fixed on the distant, imposing silhouette of the city walls, a formidable barrier that spoke of a proud and ancient people. The glint of bronze armor could be seen on the ramparts, a silent challenge that confirmed his unease. Their first steps onto this foreign soil would be met with a determined resistance. Lycon's task was simple, but critical. Find a stretch of beach where the heavy, laden ships could approach without foundering on hidden rocks, and where the men could disembark quickly, weapons ready. He traced the waterline with his eyes, noting the gentle slope of the sand, the depth of the water, and any potential obstructions. This land, so different from the rocky shores of his homeland, felt both alien and strangely captivating, even under the shadow of the impending conflict. The very air seemed to hum with anticipation, a tension that sharpened his senses and made each rustle of seagrass sound like a whisper of warning. As Lycon moved further along the coast, he noticed a curious detail. Scattered amongst the seaweed and driftwood were small, intricately carved wooden figures, weathered by the sea. They depicted animals and strange, coiled serpents, each one unique. He picked one up, the smooth, cool wood feeling surprisingly comforting in his calloused hand, a stark contrast to the rough bronze of his spear. He wondered who had crafted them, and if they held any significance for the people of this land, a fleeting thought of their lives before this day, before the storm broke. He paused, his gaze drawn to a cluster of Trojans on a bluff overlooking the bay, their figures stark against the sky. They stood in silent observation, their signals, a raised arm, a hand held high, carrying across the distance with surprising clarity. He could almost feel their collective breath, a shared moment of awe and apprehension. The sheer number of ships, a sight that had taken his own breath away moments before, was clearly having the same effect on them, a silent testament to the immensity of the undertaking. This was the moment of first contact, not with words, but with the imposing presence of 1,000 ships and the silent judgment of the land itself. Back on the bluff, Toros felt the familiar weight of his shield as he adjusted its position on his arm, a small, ingrained habit that offered a sliver of comfort amidst the unfolding spectacle. The horizon continued to fill with sails, each one a harbinger of change. He could feel the slight vibrations in the ground from the sheer mass of the approaching fleet, a deep resonance that seemed to echo the unease in his own heart. This wasn't merely an invasion, it was a migration of a different sort, a movement of men and purpose that dwarfed any localized skirmish he had ever known. This was the moment of first contact, not with words, but with the imposing presence of 1,000 ships and the silent judgment of the land itself. Back on the bluff, Toros felt the familiar weight of his shield as he adjusted its position on his arm, a small, ingrained habit that offered a sliver of comfort amidst the unfolding spectacle. The horizon continued to fill with sails, each one a harbinger of change. He could feel the slight vibrations in the ground from the sheer mass of the approaching fleet, a deep resonance that seemed to echo the unease in his own heart. This wasn't merely an invasion, it was a migration of a different sort, a movement of men and purpose that dwarfed any localized skirmish he had ever known. He exchanged a look with Helen, a silent acknowledgement of the overwhelming task that lay before them. The shouts of their own men, gathering their courage and readying their defenses, were a counterpoint to the distant, growing hum of the Achaean armada. Toros wondered if the old ways, the traditions of swift defense and fierce individual bravery, would be enough against such an organized and seemingly endless force. The very ground felt different beneath his feet, charged with the energy of an epical confrontation about to begin. The arrival of the Achaean fleet at Abydos marked the true beginning of their ordeal. While the land itself remained beautiful, its golden beaches kissed by gentle waves, the presence of so many foreign ships cast a long, disquieting shadow. The sheer scale of the armada was a physical manifestation of the oath that had been sworn and the grievance that had been carried across the sea. Toros watched as the first wave of ships lowered their smaller landing craft, the sounds of oars dipping into the water carrying a steady rhythm that seemed to seal the fate of his city. The scholarly debate about the precise location and nature of the first landings often centers on the logistical challenges faced by any large army embarking on a foreign shore. The Trojans, with their established defenses, would have been acutely aware of any potential vulnerabilities, and the Achaeans, on the other hand, would have meticulously planned their approach to minimize immediate casualties. This dance of observation and anticipation, of readiness and uncertainty, was the silent prelude to the storm. In these quiet moments before the first Achaean foot touched Trojan soil, Tauros could almost forget the vastness of the enemy gathered offshore. The great wooden effigy stood as a silent, imposing sentinel on the sandy plain. For the merchant, Lycon, accustomed to the lively rhythm of Troy's marketplace, the stillness outside the city walls felt profoundly unnatural. The usual chatter of traders and the aroma of roasting lamb had been replaced by the murmur of anxious citizens and the distant, unsettling clang of Achaean armor. Lycon, like many within the towering ramparts, found his trade routes choked, his carefully curated stock of Syrian silks and Egyptian linen now gathering dust. He had joined the others at the highest parapet, seeking some understanding of the vast enemy encampment that had spread like a gray, sun-baked stain across the landscape for so many years, each white tent a reminder of the prolonged pressure. He leaned against the cool, smooth stone of the rampart, a stark contrast to the rough weave of the sackcloth that now covered his wares, trying to count the countless Achaean tents. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, a common occurrence as the days wore on, each breath requiring a conscious effort in the relentless warmth. His wife, Ilara, had remained behind with their 2 young children, their usual bright laughter subdued by a quiet apprehension that seemed to cling to the very air within their home. Lycon remembered her pleas to conserve their grain, each handful measured with a worried frown, a stark departure from the bounty that had once filled their larders. At the city's main gate, a veteran guard, his arm marked with a network of pale scars from past skirmishes, spoke in hushed tones to a younger recruit. "They've not been idle out there," the guard muttered, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Even in their quiet, you can feel the weight of them, like a coiled serpent." He recounted the recent costly skirmishes at the shore, each encounter a grim reminder of the enemy's formidable strength and the sheer endurance required to hold against them. Lycon listened, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach, recognizing the unspoken truth. This was not a battle that would be won with a single decisive blow, but a protracted struggle that tested the very fabric of their lives. The prolonged siege had begun to shift the community's focus. The vibrant energy that once fueled the city's commerce had slowly been channeled into a shared, urgent need for survival. Lycon watched as women, their hands roughened from spinning wool into thread and grinding grain into flour, gathered near the city's well. Their hushed conversations were a quiet exchange of worries: the dwindling supply of olives, the scarcity of fresh water, the ever-present concern for the men defending the walls. One woman spoke of her brother, lost in a recent sortie, her voice catching with a sorrow that had become a familiar, shared ache among them. Ilara, her face etched with a weariness that belied her years, meticulously divided their remaining bread. "This must last us longer, Lycon," she said, her voice gentle but firm as she met his gaze. "The elders speak of rationing, of sharing what little we have." she carefully tucked a small portion aside for their children, ensuring they received their share before she herself took a meager bite. Their shared glances spoke volumes of the difficult choices they now faced daily, a constant negotiation between present needs and the uncertain hope for a future where their stores would be replenished. The seasoned guard at the gate continued his weary vigil, his eyes scanning the distant Achaean encampment. He saw not just men and tents, but a testament to their enemies' unwavering resolve. He remembered the initial shock of their arrival, the horizon darkening with sails, and the desperate scramble to fortify their defenses. Now, after so many seasons had passed, the Achaean presence had become a constant, gnawing pressure, a testament to the formidable nature of their attackers and the deep well of their patience in this long, drawn-out struggle. Lycan felt a profound shift in the city's rhythm. The boisterous celebrations of their patron gods, once a source of communal strength, now seemed tinged with a desperate supplication. He recalled the elders speaking of ancient rites, of the need to honor the divine powers with all their might. The thought of such grand processions and offerings, while a familiar practice, felt particularly poignant now, a call to appease unseen forces as much as to bolster their own courage. He wondered if the prayers and rituals, so deeply ingrained in their culture, would truly sway the tide of this relentless war. The very air within the city seemed to carry the weight of their collective experience. Each familiar scent, the baking bread, the drying herbs, was now underscored by a subtle undercurrent of anxiety. Lycan found himself more attuned to the subtle shifts in the wind, listening for any change in the distant sounds of the Achaean camp. He recognized that survival was no longer just about defending their walls, but about adapting to a way of life dictated by scarcity and the constant watchful presence of their besieging foes. The constant pressure from the Achaean camps had reshaped every aspect of life within Troy. The bustling marketplace, once a vibrant heart of the city, now echoed with a hushed, anxious murmur, its stalls sparsely populated with dwindling goods. Lycan, like so many other merchants, now found his accustomed trade routes choked, his once prized Syrian silks and Egyptian linen piled high and largely untouched. He often found himself at the highest parapet, gazing out at the vast Achaean encampment, the countless white tents stretching across the plains, a constant, unsettling reminder of the years of relentless pressure that had worn down their once unshakable confidence. He leaned against the cool, smooth stone of the rampart, a familiar comfort against his hand, as sweat beaded on his brow, a common occurrence in the persistent warmth that made each breath feel like a deliberate effort. His wife, Ilara, had taken to carefully measuring their dwindling grain, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a quiet, persistent worry for their two young children. Their home, once filled with the bright sound of play, now held a palpable tension, each shared glance between Lycan and Ilara conveying unspoken concerns about the future of their provisions and the safety of their city. Near the main gate, a veteran guard, his arm bearing the pale lines of old wounds, spoke to a younger, visibly anxious recruit. "They've learned our ways, lad," the guard rasped, his eyes fixed on the distant Achaean sentinels. "They watch, they wait, they're patient." He recounted recent skirmishes along the shore, each telling of their enemy's formidable strength and the sheer endurance needed to meet their persistent advances. The recruit clutched his bronze spear tighter, his knuckles white, the weight of the guard's words adding to the palpable tension of their long struggle. The prolonged siege had forced a profound shift in the community's collective focus. The once vigorous energy that fueled Troy's vibrant commerce had slowly been redirected towards a shared, urgent necessity for survival. Lycan observed women gathering at the city well, their hands roughened from spinning wool into thread and grinding grain into flour. Their hushed conversations, a quiet exchange of worries. They spoke of the diminishing supply of olives, the scarcity of fresh water, and the constant concern for the men standing watch on the walls. Each shared hardship, forging a deeper, albeit anxious, sense of solidarity.
Ilara, her face etched with a weariness that seemed to settle deeper with each passing season, meticulously divided their meager remaining bread. "This must last us longer, Lycan," she said, her voice gentle but firm as she met his gaze, ensuring the children received their share before taking a small portion for herself. Their shared glances communicated the difficult choices they now faced daily, a constant negotiation between their present needs and the uncertain hope for a future where their stores would be replenished, their lives no longer dictated by such stark measures of scarcity. The elders, their faces lined like ancient maps, spoke of the importance of communal rites and the need to honor their gods with unwavering devotion. Lycan remembered their discussions about ancient rituals, of the necessity to invoke divine favor as much as to bolster their own courage. He found himself wondering if the prayers and traditions, so deeply ingrained in their cultural fabric, would truly possess the power to sway the tide of this relentless war, or if they were merely echoes of a past where such challenges were met with different means. The very air within the city seemed to carry the shared experience of this prolonged ordeal. Each familiar scent, the baking bread from the communal ovens, the faint perfume of dried herbs hung for preservation, was now underscored by a subtle, pervasive undercurrent of anxiety. Lycan found himself more attuned to the subtle shifts in the wind, listening for any change in the distant muted sounds of the Aegean camp. He understood that survival was no longer solely about the strength of their walls, but about adapting to a way of life that demanded constant vigilance and resourcefulness against their besieging foes. The challenges they faced were not merely of battle, but of the very sustenance of their community. Summary. This passage details the increasing scarcity within Troy due to the prolonged siege, focusing on a merchant's family and the community's adaptations, while highlighting the psychological toll and reliance on tradition. End state. The city of Troy continues to endure the siege, its citizens grappling with dwindling resources and the ever-present threat from the Achaean forces.
A palpable tension had settled over the Achaean encampment, a feeling akin to the stillness before a storm. Young Lycan, no older than 16 summers, found himself caught in its currents, his calloused hands busy mending a torn sailcloth. He'd arrived on these shores full of youthful bravado, eager to taste glory. But the prolonged siege had begun to wear down his initial enthusiasm. The air, usually filled with the bracing scent of salt and the distant cries of gulls, now carried a restless hum of discontent. Across the sprawling camp, Lycan could see groups of warriors huddled together, their voices low and their gestures sharp, indicating a growing disharmony among the leaders. This unrest had been brewing for some time, fueled by differing opinions on strategy and a perceived lack of decisive action. Lycan overheard snippets of conversation, words like dishonor and delay drifting on the breeze. He saw two of the most respected commanders, their faces grim, engaged in a heated exchange near the commander's tent, their argument a stark contrast to the ordered preparations for battle. The younger warriors, like himself, felt the sting of this discord, unsure who to follow or what to believe when their own superiors seemed so divided. He often found himself wondering if their leaders truly understood the daily struggles and hopes of the common soldier. The argument he witnessed, a fiery clash of personalities and strategies,
seemed to mirror the broader disagreements plaguing the alliance. One commander, known for his relentless aggression, advocated for immediate, all-out assaults, believing that their sheer numbers and superior weaponry would overwhelm the Trojans. He often gestured wildly, his voice booming across the assembled men, demanding action. The other, a more cautious leader, favored a strategy of attrition, of slowly strangling the city's supply lines and waiting for internal dissent to weaken their resolve. His calm demeanor a stark contrast to the other's fiery rhetoric.
Lycon felt a tremor of anticipation as he watched this unfolding drama, for he knew that such disagreements often led to significant shifts in fortune, for better or worse. He remembered the wise words of an older soldier, a man whose weathered face held the marks of countless skirmishes, who had once told him, "A divided army is like a ship with two captains, Lycon. It will only drift further from its course." These words often echoed in Lycon's mind whenever he saw the leaders locked in their disagreements, a persistent reminder of the vulnerability of their vast enterprise. Then a different kind of tension arose, one that cleared the air of political bickering and focused everyone's attention. A formal challenge was issued, a call for a single combat that would settle, at least for a day, the question of martial superiority. The chosen champions were formidable figures, warriors whose reputations preceded them, their names whispered with awe and a healthy dose of fear. Lycon found a vantage point near the center of the field, the rough wool of his tunic scratching against his skin as he settled in, his heart beginning to beat a more rapid rhythm. The appointed warriors emerged from their respective encampments, their bronze armor gleaming under the clear sky. The air around them seemed to crackle with a potent energy, a visible manifestation of their immense strength and skill. As they circled each other, the sounds of the camp seemed to recede, leaving only the rhythmic clang of their feet on the packed earth and the sharp intake of their breaths. Lycon could feel a faint warmth emanating from them, the physical exertion of their preparatory movements already apparent, a testament to the rigorous training that forged such men. Their weapons met with a ringing clash that vibrated through Lycon's very bones, a sound both terrifying and exhilarating. Each parry and thrust was executed with a precision honed by years of relentless practice. He saw the sweat glisten on their foreheads and the strain etched onto their faces as they engaged, their movements a dance of death and destruction. One warrior, favoring a sweeping sword, pressed his advantage, while the other, wielding a heavy spear, defended with a stoic resilience that Lycon found particularly admirable. Amidst the fierce dueling, Lycon's gaze drifted to a figure standing apart from the main throng of soldiers. It was Achilles, his presence commanding, his powerful frame clad in gleaming armor that seemed to absorb and reflect the light of the sun. He stood with a stillness that belied the ferocity of the combat unfolding before him, his face impassive, yet his eyes, Lycon noted, were fixed with an intense concentration on the struggle. It was as if he were studying every move, every feint, every block, his own formidable prowess held in careful, deliberate reserve, like a coiled spring ready to unleash its power. Achilles' detachment was more than just observation. It was a demonstration of his own unique position within the Achaean forces. He was their most fearsome weapon, a force of nature on the battlefield. Yet his pride and his complex relationship with the commanders often kept him at an arm's length from their day-to-day stratagems. Lycon felt a pang of envy mixed with awe. He longed for the day when he, too, might possess such skill and command such respect, to be able to stand apart, not from disinterest, but from the sheer weight of his own proven might. The duel, after a prolonged and intense exchange, ended not with a decisive blow, but with a mutual, grudging respect. Both champions, though weary, acknowledged each other's skill, their labored breaths a shared testament to their effort. Lycon felt a strange sense of disappointment that the clash had not resulted in a clear victor, yet also a grudging admiration for the warrior code that valued such displays of honor, even in the midst of a grinding war. He understood that such duels, while perhaps an indulgence, served to remind them of the individual valor that still held sway on the battlefield. A small moment of levity then broke the intense atmosphere. As the two champions stepped back, a young squire, eager to impress, rushed forward to tend to them, only to stumble over a discarded shield. He scrambled to recover, his face flushing a deep crimson, eliciting a few chuckles from the onlookers. Lycon, despite the underlying tension of the prolonged siege, found himself smiling at the squire's clumsy attempt at formality, a brief reminder of the human element that persisted even in the harshest of circumstances. This period of intense individual combat, however, did not resolve the deeper rifts. The commanders' arguments continued, their voices sometimes rising to shouts that carried across the camp. Lycon felt a growing sense of unease. He noticed that the provisions, while still plentiful, seemed to be distributed with a growing sense of urgency. And the daily drills, while still rigorous, seemed to lack a certain spark, as if the soldiers, too, were sensing the discord at the top. The very ground beneath their tents seemed to vibrate with a nervous energy. A wise old carpenter, his hands stained with wood sap and his eyes carrying the depth of years, was working on reinforcing a section of the camp's outer defenses. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy cloth, and remarked to Lycon, "When the foundation shakes, young one, the whole structure is at risk." He was referring not just to the physical fortifications, but to the very alliance itself, a sentiment that resonated with Lycon's own growing apprehension. The sheer scale of their undertaking, the immense force gathered here, felt increasingly fragile due to these internal divisions. The elder carpenter's words struck a chord, prompting Lycon to think about the foundations of their endeavor. He realized that the pride and rivalries among the commanders were not just personal failings. They were a direct threat to the success of their mission. He saw how the younger soldiers, eager for action and glory, were becoming disillusioned by the constant infighting and the lack of clear, unified command. He often heard them discussing the relative merits of different leaders, their loyalty divided, a dangerous situation when such unity was paramount. Despite the internal strife, a period of relative quiet settled over the front lines, a brief respite from the constant skirmishes. Lycon used this time to practice his spear throwing, the familiar weight of the weapon a comfort in his hands. He felt the satisfying thud as it struck the practice target, his aim improving with each throw. He observed that even when the commanders quarreled, the daily routines of soldiering, sharpening weapons, tending to horses, preparing meals, continued, a testament to the enduring discipline that held their vast army together. This quiet period also allowed for reflection, and Lycon found himself contemplating the sheer scale of the Achaean effort. He had seen the countless ships that had carried them across the sea, the vast number of men drawn from a dozen kingdoms, all united by a single purpose. Yet, he also saw how easily that unity could be fractured
by personal ambition or differing opinions. He wondered if the Trojans, behind their mighty walls, faced similar internal struggles, or if their singular focus on defense provided a stronger bond. He realized that the strength of any force lay not just in its weapons, but in the cohesion of its people. As Lycan prepared his meager rations for the evening meal, the crackling of the small fire provided a familiar, comforting sound. The rhythmic pounding of hammers from the armorers' workshops continued, a steady pulse beneath the murmur of distant conversations. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new skirmishes, and the ongoing struggle to maintain morale and unity in the face of a determined enemy. The weight of their shared endeavor pressed upon him, a constant reminder of the long road ahead. As Lycan cleaned his spear, the rhythmic clang of the nearby blacksmith's hammer provided its usual, steady comfort. Prince Hector walked through the city, the familiar scent of baking bread and drying herbs a comforting presence amidst the growing unease. He felt the coarse wool of his tunic against his skin, a stark contrast to the smooth, gleaming bronze of the armor he would soon don. The sounds of the city were a familiar symphony. The clang of hammers from the smithies, the cries of merchants hawking their wares, and the chatter of children playing in the sun-dappled squares, all underscoring the vibrant life that now seemed threatened. He heard the whispers of the citizens as he passed, their hopeful gazes fixed upon him, their collective hope resting on his broad shoulders as the city's protector.
He paused at the city gates, watching the diligent work of the masons reinforcing the stone ramparts, the sharp smell of cut stone filling the air. These were the same walls that had stood for generations, built by his ancestors, and the responsibility for their continued defense weighed heavily on him. He remembered his father, King Priam, a man whose years had granted him wisdom, but also a certain weariness, often speaking of the fragile peace maintained through careful diplomacy and the strength of their fortifications. Hector felt the weight of his father's crown, not on his head, but in the quiet understanding of his duty to protect his people. His thoughts then turned to his own household, to his wife Andromache and their young son Astyanax. He quickened his pace, eager to see their faces, the joy in their eyes a stark contrast to the grim reality of the encroaching enemy. He knew that the coming days, or perhaps even hours, might force him to make impossible choices, choices that would forever alter their lives. The warmth of their embrace, the innocent laughter of his son, these were the treasures he fought to preserve, the true heart of Troy that beat within these ancient walls. He met with his brothers in the royal council chamber, the polished cedar table reflecting the torchlight. Cassandra, her eyes often distant and troubled, spoke of foreboding. Deiphobus, ever confident, proposed a sortie to disrupt the enemy's supply lines, his voice firm. Helenus, more measured, advised patience and prayer, his words carrying the weight of ancient lore. Their differing opinions, born of courage, fear, and varied interpretations of the signs, highlighted the immense pressure they all faced, a testament to the complex tapestry of leadership under duress. Hector listened intently, his gaze sweeping over their faces, each brother a unique reflection of the city's spirit. He considered Deiphobus's bold proposal, a flicker of admiration for his brother's eagerness, but tempered it with caution. A rash move could expose their weakened points, a mistake they could not afford. He felt a deep respect for Helenus's measured approach, understanding the importance of maintaining spiritual fortitude, yet his own nature leaned towards proactive defense. The weight of their kingdom rested not just on their strength of arms, but on the clarity of their judgment. He then turned his attention to the scrolls spread across the table, detailing troop movements and resource allocations. The familiar scent of aged parchment filled the air, a scent he associated with the long hours spent poring over strategy. He ran a hand over the rough, inked lines, picturing the men who would execute these plans, the common soldiers who stood ready to defend their homes. He knew that their loyalty and courage were his greatest assets, and he felt a profound responsibility to ensure their efforts were not in vain. He made his decision, a quiet resolve settling over him. "We will not sortie yet," he declared, his voice steady, cutting through the varied opinions. "We will strengthen our defenses, conserve our strength, and await their next move. We must be prepared for a long struggle, not a quick skirmish." He felt a sense of clarity wash over him, a deep conviction in his path, even knowing the inherent risks of a defensive posture. As he continued his walk through the city's lower quarters, he passed women tending to their hearths, the comforting aroma of cooking stews mingling with the sharp tang of olive oil. He saw men mending fishing nets and children chasing pigeons, a semblance of normalcy clinging to the edges of their awareness. Yet, beneath the surface, a taut string of apprehension was stretched tight within the populace. They looked to him not just as a prince, but as their shield, their ultimate bulwark against the storm gathering beyond the walls. He watched a group of elders gathered beneath the shade of a great plane tree, their conversation hushed. They spoke of the omens, of the shifting winds, and of the need for the gods' continued favor. Hector understood their concerns. The old ways, the connection to the divine, were as vital to their resilience as any bronze spear or stone wall. He knew that the people drew strength not only from his leadership, but from their shared traditions and their faith in powers beyond their immediate understanding. He offered a brief greeting to the elders, a nod of respect for their wisdom, before moving on. He felt the weight of their expectations, the silent plea for assurance that he could not always give. His commitment to defend his home, even knowing the potential cost, was a quiet but powerful force that resonated through the city, a silent promise whispered on the wind rustling through the cypress trees. He was prepared to stand, to fight, and to lead them through whatever trials lay ahead. The day's duties had left their mark, but life within Troy moved forward, each citizen playing their part in the unfolding drama. A strange ailment began to spread through the Achaean encampment, a weariness that settled deeper than simple fatigue. A priestess named Lyra, whose hands were always cool and steady, moved among the feverish men, dipping cloths in buckets of water drawn from a nearby stream. She felt the rough weave of the cloth against her skin as she soothed a burning brow, her eyes constantly scanning the skies for signs, her ears attuned to the rustling leaves and the distant cries of birds. Her task was not merely to comfort the sick, but to decipher the unspoken messages from the powers that governed their fates, a duty that weighed heavily on her. Lyra noticed a growing disquiet among the men, a sense of unease that mirrored her own growing apprehension. They spoke in hushed tones of unsettling dreams, their voices barely carrying above the ever-present sounds of the camp.
the distant hammering from the shipyards, the clatter of weapons being readied, and the ceaseless murmur of thousands of voices. She observed how their gazes lingered on the skies, seeking reassurance in the flight of an eagle or the shape of a cloud, yet finding only deeper questions about the correctness of their actions. The commanders, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to this subtle shift in the soldiers' spirits, their focus remaining fixed on the unyielding walls of Troy. The priestess felt a growing certainty that the recent actions of the Achaean leadership had stirred a formidable displeasure. She had performed the rites for purification after a particularly brutal skirmish, and the smoke from the sacrificial fires had twisted into shapes that spoke not of divine approval, but of a profound disharmony. She recalled observing a flock of crows circling overhead, their raucous calls echoing a warning that few seemed willing to heed, a stark contrast to the clear omens of favor they had received in the early days of their arrival. This feeling of impending consequence was a persistent shadow, making each breath feel a little heavier. She sought counsel from an elder priest, a man whose knowledge of divine signs was as deep as the sea. He listened patiently as Lyra described the unsettling omens and the growing sickness, his own brow furrowed with concern. "The gods are not capricious children, Lyra," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They respond to our deeds, to our respect, and to the purity of our intentions." He then spoke of how some of the younger warriors, eager for glory, had engaged in practices that, while outwardly appearing devout, lacked the true reverence that appeased the divine. This conversation added another layer to Lyra's unease, planting seeds of doubt about their cause. The elder priest explained that a common practice among certain distant tribes involved elaborate feasting and the ritualistic offering of wine to appease the earth spirits, but this was considered a distraction from the more solemn rites required by the sky deities. He described how some Achaeans, in their haste to secure victory, had begun to incorporate these less reverent customs into their own rituals, hoping to gain favor through sheer volume of offerings rather than the sincerity of their devotion. This blending of practices, he warned, could easily lead to unintended consequences, angering those they sought to please. Lyra returned to her duties, the priest's words echoing in her mind as she tended to the ailing soldiers. She found herself questioning the directives that came from the commanders, wondering if their relentless pursuit of victory had blinded them to the deeper currents of divine will. They continued to push for assaults on the city's formidable defenses, ignoring the growing number of sick men and the increasingly unfavorable signs. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor of fear ran through her as she considered the possibility that their entire endeavor might be built upon a foundation of spiritual miscalculation. It felt as though they were being subtly guided, not by divine favor, but by a more insidious, deliberate influence that exploited their pride. One soldier, a young man named Theron, who had always been fiercely loyal and full of vigor, now lay listless on his pallet, his skin pale and clammy. Lyra dipped a cloth in water, the coolness a small comfort against his fevered skin, and whispered a prayer for his recovery. She saw the vacant look in his eyes, a stark contrast to the eager spirit she remembered from their arrival on these shores. He murmured softly, not of battles or glory, but of a feeling of abandonment, as if the very heavens had turned their backs on the Achaean cause, a sentiment that Lyra heard echoed in the hushed conversations of many others. She observed a peculiar detail. The birds that used to gather in abundance around the camp were now scarce, and those that remained seemed to fly with a nervous energy, their calls sharper and more anxious than before. this was a significant change, as the camp had always been a place where gulls and other seabirds were a common sight, their presence a familiar comfort. Their absence now felt like a clear message, a withdrawal of natural companionship that intensified the feeling of isolation.
A debate was clearly unfolding, not with raised voices or open arguments, but in the weary sighs of the soldiers and the guarded expressions of the priestess. Was their current plight a result of poor strategy, a common occurrence in any protracted conflict, or was it something far more profound, a divine judgment passed upon them? Lyra felt the weight of responsibility acutely, knowing that the interpretation of these signs could determine the fate of their entire expedition, and the lives of thousands rested on such delicate understandings. She found herself torn between the practical needs of caring for the sick and the spiritual imperative to understand and perhaps appease the unseen forces. During this unsettling period, the commanders continued to press their generals for strategies to breach the Trojan walls, their conversations filled with talk of siege engines and battlefield tactics, as if the physical aspects of the war were the only ones that mattered. They were, it seemed, unable to grasp the subtle shifts in fortune or the unspoken anxieties that plagued their ranks, their focus so intensely fixed on their objective that they failed to see the ground beneath their feet crumbling. This disconnect between the leadership and the common experience of the army was becoming increasingly evident. With the troubling signs and the spreading sickness, Lyra felt a profound sense of uncertainty about their path forward. King Priam, his brow furrowed with the weight of a decade of conflict, convened his council within the palace's cool stone halls. The murmur of advisors and generals filled the space, a familiar backdrop to his growing unease as the Achaean camps remained a constant, unwelcome presence on the plains. He turned to the wisest elder in the kingdom, a man whose face seemed etched by the very history of Troy, seeking solace and guidance in these trying times. The elder, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, spoke of the old ways, of the respect due to the divine powers that shaped the fortunes of mortals. He reminded them that enduring hardship was a test, and that appeasing the gods, especially in times of great peril, was a sacred duty passed down through countless generations. His words carried the quiet authority of one who had seen empires rise and fall, his perspective grounded in the enduring traditions that had guided their ancestors. Following the elders' council, King Priam decreed a grand procession to honor the city's patron deities. A palpable shift occurred throughout Troy as word spread. A sense of purpose, however fragile, began to mend the frayed edges of communal spirit. The air began to carry the fragrant aroma of burning cedar, a scent that had always signified reverence and a plea for divine favor during times of crisis. As the day of the procession dawned, the streets, usually echoing with the sounds of commerce and daily life, were filled with a different kind of energy. The citizens, their faces a mixture of hope and lingering apprehension, gathered along the route. They watched as priests and priestesses, adorned in ceremonial robes, carried the city's most sacred icons, the gilded statues and ancient symbols that represented their lineage and their connection to the heavens. The procession moved with solemn dignity, the rhythmic chanting of prayers weaving through the assembled crowds. People paused their daily labors to join the procession, their voices adding to the chorus of supplication. The elder, observing the scene from a shaded archway, noted the way families walked together, their hands clasped, drawing strength from each other's presence as they faced the shared uncertainty of their fate. He saw a flicker of renewed hope in many eyes, a shared belief that their devotion might turn the tide. Yet, even amidst the outward show of piety, a deep-seated worry for the future remained unspoken. The elder understood that the favor of the gods was a fickle thing,
a delicate balance that could be easily disrupted by pride or by missteps in their actions. He knew that while these rituals provided comfort and a sense of control, they were but one element in the complex tapestry of survival. The ritualistic offerings of grain and precious oils were carefully arranged, each item representing a sacrifice made by the people of Troy. This act of communal giving, born from the elders' guidance and Priam's command, served to reinforce the bonds between the citizens and their leaders, and more importantly, their faith in the powers that watched over them. It was a demonstration of their collective will to persevere, a testament to their deep-rooted cultural practices. The elders of the city discussed the strategic implications of the ongoing siege during the quiet hours following the procession. They debated whether the visible display of their faith would deter the Achaean attackers, or if it would be perceived as a sign of weakness. This internal discussion highlighted the constant challenge of leadership, balancing spiritual needs with the practical realities of warfare and resource management. The continued presence of the Achaean forces meant that scarcity remained a pressing concern for many families within the city. Despite the recent focus on divine appeasement, the daily struggle for sustenance persisted, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their situation. The king, receiving reports from his quartermasters, understood that spiritual strength alone could not fill empty granaries. The elder, as he watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the Achaean encampments, felt a sense of both accomplishment and continued vigilance. He knew that the gods were honored, but the war would continue, and the resilience of Troy would be tested in ways yet unforeseen. The shared experience of the procession, however, had undoubtedly strengthened the community's resolve, binding them together against the encroaching threat. The ancient reverence for the divine, coupled with the enduring human spirit, was the true strength that surrounded King Priam and his people. Years had spun into a relentless cycle, each turning of the seasons marked not by the bounty of harvest or the joy of festivals, but by the ceaseless grind of attrition. Within the high walls of Troy, life had become a study in careful rationing and quiet resilience. Ilara, her hands calloused and permanently stained with the faint purple hue of crushed herbs used for meager seasonings, sat with a small group of women near the city's central well. The familiar, comforting scent of warm, freshly baked bread that once filled the streets was now a distant memory, replaced by the pervasive, dry odor of stored grains and the faint, ever-present smell of wood smoke from cooking fires that burned sparingly. She remembered a time when the marketplace overflowed with vibrant colors and the cheerful din of merchants haggling, a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere now, where hushed conversations revolved around dwindling reserves and the distant, yet constant, murmur of the Achaean encampments outside their gates. The women listened as Lyra, her face gaunt but her spirit unbent, recounted a story of her husband, a skilled carpenter, who had ventured out for wood during an early lull in the fighting, only to be caught in a swift Achaean raid and never return. Her voice, though low, carried a profound weight of sorrow that many of them understood all too well. It was a sorrow that had become a familiar companion, a dull ache beneath the surface of their daily efforts. Lyra spoke of his laughter, a sound that could fill a room, now silenced forever, and the children he would never see grow. This shared remembrance, a testament to the personal losses that underpinned the city's collective struggle, served as a somber reminder of the human cost of this long, drawn-out conflict. Following Lyra's painful memory, the conversation shifted to the immediate concerns of their survival. Ilara, carefully measuring out portions of barley flour into rough clay bowls, felt a familiar pang of anxiety. Their stores were lower than they had been at the start of the past winter, and the scouts reported that the Achaeans were more vigilant than ever, making any attempts at foraging or resupply near impossible. She remembered the king's decree to conserve every grain, a directive that had long since been followed to the letter, leaving them with precious little margin for error, and she wondered if their carefully husbanded resources would truly see them through the coming months, or if harder choices lay ahead. The women nodded in understanding as Alara shared her worries, their own small bowls of flour mirroring the city's overall scarcity. It was a quiet understanding that passed between them, a shared knowledge born of necessity and the constant awareness of their limited provisions. They had learned to stretch every scrap, to make the most of withered vegetables and dried fruits, and to find sustenance in foods that once might have been discarded as too tough or flavorless. This constant adaptation, a testament to their ingenuity and grim determination, was a subtle but powerful form of resistance against the relentless pressure of the siege, a way of maintaining a semblance of control in an uncontrollable situation.
Nearby, a group of younger women were attempting to repair worn sandals, their nimble fingers working with thread spun from coarse wool, while a few of the oldest women sat with spindles, their movements practiced and steady as they turned raw fibers into usable yarn. The air around them was filled with the quiet hum of their work, and the occasional sharp crack of a breaking thread that would elicit a small sigh or a shared knowing glance. They often spoke of the times before, when new sandals were readily available, and the thought of mending instead of replacing them was a laughable luxury, a detail that now felt impossibly distant. A sudden gust of wind rustled through the partially open courtyard, carrying with it the faintest, almost imperceptible hint of the Achaean camp, a mix of distant voices and the metallic clink of armor, a reminder that their precarious peace was always just beyond the city's formidable defenses. It was a sound that always made them pause, their efforts momentarily suspended, their senses sharpened by the ingrained habit of vigilance. This constant awareness, a subtle tension that permeated their days, prevented any true relaxation and kept their focus firmly fixed on the immediate tasks at hand, lest a moment of inattention lead to greater hardship. One of the younger women, Maris, who had only recently been married before her husband joined the city's defenders, let out a small, almost involuntary sigh as she fumbled with a particularly stubborn knot in her sandal strap. She looked up, her eyes catching Ilara's, and offered a weak smile, a fleeting attempt at lightheartedness that didn't quite mask the underlying weariness. Ilara returned the smile, a gesture of solidarity, and Maris then whispered, a touch of humor in her voice, that she was beginning to think these sandals had a personal vendetta against her, as if determined to unravel themselves at the most inconvenient moments. A small joke to break the solemnity. Building on Maris's lightheartedness, another woman, Kalia, who was known for her practical nature and her sharp wit, chimed in with her own observation, remarking that their efforts were much like the siege itself, slow, painstaking work that demanded immense patience and a willingness to accept small victories, like a mended seam or a successfully rationed meal. She added that it was perhaps more rewarding than the Achaeans' efforts, which seemed to consist mostly of shouting and kicking dirt around, and that she suspected their own skills in weaving and mending would outlast the attackers' brute force, a sentiment that brought a ripple of quiet agreement. Their conversation then turned to the peculiar practice of one of the Achaean commanders, who, according to returning scouts, spent hours meticulously organizing pebbles into geometric patterns near the enemy lines. The older women exchanged glances, finding it a strange and unsettling detail, and wondered what purpose such an activity could possibly serve in the midst of such a brutal war. Was it a form of ritual, a way of seeking favor, or simply a sign of a mind unraveling under the immense pressure of a prolonged siege? This unusual observation, a tiny crack in the otherwise grim portrait of the enemy, offered a brief moment of distraction and contemplation. This shared contemplation of the enemy's odd behavior also brought forth a discussion about the nature of command and strategy within their own city, a topic that was never far from their thoughts. Some of the women expressed quiet concern about whether the princes were making the wisest decisions, citing the prolonged stalemate and the increasing hardship within Troy. They recalled the elders' counsel about the importance of honoring the gods and maintaining traditions, and wondered if adherence to those ancient ways was still the best path forward, or if new strategies were desperately needed to break the relentless grip of the besiegers. The question of whether their traditional ways would survive the war hung unspoken in the air, a worry that gnawed at many of them. They had seen the impact of years of isolation, the way familiar customs were strained by necessity, and the constant threat that chipped away at their collective spirit. The careful preparation of meals, the rituals of hospitality, the very fabric of their social interactions all felt like fragile threads in a storm, and they quietly wondered if they would be able to mend them after the conflict, or if the damage would be too profound. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the courtyard, the women began to gather their meager supplies and prepare to return to their homes. Elara carefully placed the day's portion of flour into a cloth bag, feeling its familiar weight against her hip. She knew that tomorrow would bring more of the same, the careful rationing, the quiet anxieties, and the enduring hope for a future free from the shadow of the Achaean ships. The well, a constant source of life, now also served as a quiet reminder of their shared endurance and the strength they found in each other. In the growing dusk, Elara carried the day's experiences into rest, the weight of her task a familiar pressure. The vast Achaean camp, usually alive with the clang of bronze and the shouts of men, now carried a hushed, mournful tone. Young Calus, a soldier barely a man, felt the weight of this silence press upon him as he walked past the rows of tents. His friend Lycon, brave and quick-witted, lay within one of those tents, a victim not of a Trojan spear, but of a sudden burning sickness that had swept through their ranks. The air, usually carrying the scent of wood smoke and cooking meat, now seemed tinged with a sterile, medicinal smell from the herbs gathered by the camp's healers. Calus remembered Lycon's laughter only a few days prior, his boasts of returning home laden with spoils, and the stark contrast with the stillness that now claimed him. This profound loss had shaken the foundations of Calus's simple faith in the war and its purpose. He saw it reflected in the faces of the other soldiers, the usual swagger replaced by a gnawing apprehension, a shared vulnerability that bound them closer than any oath. Their commanders, men usually seen as unshakable figures of authority, now appeared troubled, their council meetings lasting longer, their pronouncements more uncertain. Calus, a mere foot soldier, could only observe these shifts, feeling a growing unease about the unseen forces that seemed to govern their fate, forces that could strike down a healthy man in his prime. Further into the camp, away from the hushed tents of the sick, a different kind of stillness had descended. Achilles, the swift and mighty warrior, was rarely seen among his men. His customary presence, a whirlwind of activity and martial prowess, had vanished,
replaced by an unnerving solitude. Callas had seen him once, standing apart near the sea, his bronze armor gleaming dully under the pale sky, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon as if searching for something lost. The vibrant pride that usually radiated from the hero seemed to have been extinguished, leaving behind a hollow, consuming emptiness that Callas could almost feel from afar. The general's tent, usually a hub of strategic discussion and the scent of oiled leather, was now a place of hushed whispers and strained faces. Callas had heard snatches of conversation from the soldiers who served there, talk of the gods, of omens, and of a growing discord that festered beneath the surface of their command. The warriors who had once vied fiercely for glory on the battlefield now found themselves locked in a bitter dispute over strategy and honor, their rivalries amplified by the grim circumstances. This internal strife, Callas realized, was as dangerous as any enemy spear, weakening their resolve at a critical time.
It was during this period of disquiet that Lycan's death became more than just a personal tragedy for Callas. It became a catalyst. The young soldier felt a burgeoning anger, a deep well of resentment for the circumstances that had stolen his friend and seemed to be chipping away at the very spirit of their army. He found himself wrestling with a profound question. What was the true cost of this war, and who truly dictated their path? Their commanders, the gods, or the sheer unpredictable nature of fate? This internal conflict simmered, a new tension building within him, distinct from the external threats of the battlefield. The grief that consumed Achilles was a force of nature, shaping the very atmosphere around him. His companions, men who had shared countless battles and faced death at his side, now approached him with caution, their usual camaraderie strained by the sheer intensity of his sorrow. They saw a transformation occurring, a hardening of his heart that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The warrior who had once fought for glory and honor now seemed driven by a singular, all-consuming purpose: vengeance for his fallen comrade, a path he knew might well lead to his own demise. They watched, their own hearts heavy, as Achilles prepared himself for a new kind of battle, one waged not for the honor of their kings or the spoils of victory, but for the memory of a lost friend. His polished armor seemed to absorb the light, his face a mask of grim determination. He spoke of his vow, his voice rough with unshed tears, a promise made to the silent heavens and the earth that held his friend. The magnitude of his grief was a tangible thing, a dark cloud that overshadowed any lingering thoughts of personal glory or the strategic needs of the wider campaign.
This personal vendetta, born from profound loss, began to influence the broader conduct of the war. While commanders debated logistics and the strength of Trojan defenses, Achilles' singular focus created a ripple effect through the camp. His absence from the ranks meant a void in their fighting force, but his intent, once unleashed, promised a devastating impact on the enemy. The soldiers understood that their mighty warrior was no longer fighting for the same reasons as before. His personal quest for retribution had become a powerful, unpredictable element in their ongoing struggle. The other warriors, witnessing Achilles' raw grief and his unwavering commitment to avenge Lycon, found their own perspectives shifting. They recalled their own lost comrades, the camaraderie forged in the fires of battle. The moral dilemma of Achilles' path resonated deeply. Was it noble to seek such personal revenge, or was it a dangerous obsession that could unravel their entire purpose? This internal debate among the soldiers added another layer of complexity to the already strained atmosphere of the Achaean encampment, highlighting the human cost of protracted conflict. One evening, as the sky bled into hues of orange and purple, Callas sat with a few other soldiers, sharing a meager portion of dried figs. The sound of waves lapping against the shore was a constant, low murmur, a stark contrast to the recent cacophony of battle. He looked at his worn sandals, the leather cracked and stiff from endless marching. He wondered, as he often did now, if the gods truly guided their actions, or if their fates were merely the sum of human choices, made in moments of passion, grief, and ambition. He turned to his companions, his voice barely a whisper. Do you think Lycaon would want this? This endless sorrow? This burning need for revenge? The question hung in the quiet air between them, a shared moment of vulnerability. They offered no easy answers, only nods and the silent acknowledgement of their own fears and doubts. The path Achilles had chosen, forged in the crucible of personal loss, was a heavy one, and its shadow now stretched across every man in the camp, forcing them to confront the true meaning of loyalty and the devastating weight of grief.
As the stars began to prick the darkening sky, the camp settled into a different kind of quiet. The usual boisterous songs and tales of past glories were replaced by a subdued reflection. The focus had shifted, not away from the war, but inward, towards the profound impact of loss on the men who fought it. The air, devoid of the usual sounds of revelry, carried instead the quiet, persistent echo of grief, a reminder of the deep personal costs that lay beneath the grand narrative of their campaign. The soldiers, their faces etched with a mixture of weariness and a dawning understanding, began to prepare for the night's watch. Calus, his thoughts still with Lycaon and the warrior Achilles, felt a new resolve solidify within him. He adjusted the leather strap of his helmet, the familiar weight a small comfort. The quest for vengeance, he realized, was a powerful force, but the quiet strength of shared sorrow and the enduring bonds of camaraderie were perhaps even more so, forming the true heart of their enduring struggle, even as the enemy remained beyond the walls. Calus settled into his watch, the cool night breeze raising goosebumps on his arms. Tomorrow would bring its own demands, and the weight of what had happened, and what might yet come, settled upon him like a familiar cloak. The fortunes of war shifted like the desert winds, a truth keenly felt by the defenders of Troy. A seasoned commander, his beard now streaked with gray from the long years of siege, paced the ramparts. He watched the Achaean encampment, a sprawling city of tents that had become a permanent blight on the horizon. He had seen them grow complacent, their initial fervor dulled by the endless stalemate, a lapse that offered a sliver of hope. This period of reduced Achaean activity, a noticeable lull in their probing attacks, allowed the Trojans to consolidate their defenses and replenish their dwindling stores of arrows, a critical task that occupied many hands.
Building on this observed quiet, the commander initiated a series of small, calculated raids along the periphery of the Achaean lines. These sorties, executed with speed and precision, aimed to disrupt enemy patrols and gather intelligence, rather than engage in large-scale confrontations. The scouts, returning with their reports, described a noticeable disarray in the Achaean ranks, a subtle fragmentation of their unified command that hinted at internal friction. It was a welcome change from the relentless pressure they had endured for so long, a breathing space that allowed the besieged populace to regain some semblance of their former rhythm. Meanwhile, across the plains, an Achaean commander, accustomed to decisive action, felt a mounting frustration. He saw his men's morale waver under the oppressive sameness of the siege, their eagerness to strike dulled by repeated failures and the perceived inaction of their leaders. He argued vehemently with his peers, his voice echoing with impatience as he advocated for a more aggressive strategy, one that would force a decisive engagement. He felt the weight of his own reputation, built on swift victories, crumbling with each passing season, a sentiment he expressed through heated exchanges. This Achaean commander then led a costly, unsuccessful sortie against a newly reinforced section of the Trojan walls. The skirmish, though brief, was brutal, and the loss of men was keenly felt by the survivors who limped back to their camps. He watched his warriors, their armor battered and their faces grim, their usual boisterous camaraderie replaced by a heavy silence, a clear sign of their flagging spirits. This setback, a stark reminder of the unyielding strength of Troy, fueled his determination to find a different path, a way to break the deadlock that gnawed at his resolve. The back-and-forth nature of this prolonged conflict, marked by periods of intense fighting followed by unsettling lulls, had begun to wear down the mental fortitude of both armies. The Trojans, accustomed to the ebb and flow of battle, found moments of quietude unnerving, always anticipating the next devastating blow. This psychological strain, the constant anticipation of danger, seeped into their daily lives, making even the simplest tasks feel fraught with a hidden tension. One such task, the mending of fishing nets by the riverbank, provided a rare moment of relative peace for a group of Trojan women. They worked with practiced hands, the rough fibers of the ropes creating a familiar friction against their skin. One of them, her brow furrowed in thought, recounted a conversation she had overheard in the marketplace. It spoke of a peculiar Achaean custom of offering significant gifts when faced with defeat, a practice that some dismissed as a mere ruse, while others saw it as a genuine attempt to appease the angered gods. On the Achaean side, the whispers of such traditions also circulated, though with a different tenor. A scholar who had traveled widely before the war recalled hearing tales from distant lands about the use of immense wooden effigies in various rituals. He mused that perhaps such an offering, if crafted with ingenuity and purpose, might serve as a novel way to deceive the enemy, to sow confusion and exploit their longing for peace. He debated the efficacy of such a complex ruse with his associates, their discussions filled with cautious speculation. The divergence in their strategic approaches, the Trojans relying on reinforced fortifications and opportunistic raids, while the Achaeans grappled with dwindling morale and internal disagreement, created a delicate balance. This period of shifting fortunes, where neither side could claim a decisive advantage, underscored the immense human cost of the protracted siege and the cleverness required to overcome such a formidable adversary. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, both in defense and in the pursuit of victory. Around the city's perimeter, the familiar sounds of daily life continued their ancient rhythm, a defiant heartbeat against the encroaching shadow of war. The air inside the massive wooden structure felt close, a mix of dry lumber and the nervous breath of men. Odysseus, his mind a whirlwind of strategy, moved amongst them, his voice a low rumble that carried an unnerving calm. He watched as the soldiers, picked for their silence and their strength, checked the fittings of their shields, the dull gleam of bronze a stark contrast to the wood surrounding them. These were men accustomed to the open sea and the clash of arms in broad daylight, now confined in a belly of deception, waiting for a signal that would unleash a decade of pent-up fury. He felt the rough grain of the horse's flank under his palm, the immense scale of the undertaking settling upon him with the weight of destiny. He had explained it to them in hushed tones, away from the suspicious eyes of the camp commanders who still bickered over strategy. This was no direct assault, no glorious charge that would earn them favor from the Skywatchers. This was a game of cunning, a subtle poison slipped into the city's unsuspecting throat. The plan required a silence so profound that even the shift of a footfall could betray them, a discipline forged not in the heat of battle, but in the cold dread of discovery. He saw in their eyes the understanding of the immense risk, a shared knowledge that this single audacious gambit could either break the endless stalemate or seal their doom in a way far more ignominious than any battlefield death. One such soldier, a man named Kyle, habitually rubbed his thumb over a smooth gray stone he kept tucked in his tunic. He felt its familiar coolness now, a small comfort against the growing apprehension. He had seen his share of battles, the brutal efficiency of the spear and the shield, but this felt different. He listened as Odysseus outlined the precise moment of their emergence, the swift silencing of any sentries, the coordinated rush to the gates. The sheer audacity of it made his stomach churn. He wondered if the years of siege had truly broken the spirit of Troy, or if this wooden gift, however massive, would merely be met with suspicion and disdain, another failed attempt to breach their formidable defenses. The gathered soldiers, a select few from various contingents, understood the delicate nature of their task. They were to appear as a votive offering, a gesture of surrender from the seemingly departed Achaean host, left behind as a token of gratitude for a safe passage home. Odysseus, his gaze sharp, reinforced the need for absolute secrecy once the ship sailed away. He watched them, these chosen few, their faces set in grim determination, as they practiced the silent dismantling of the concealed panel, the methodical arrangement of their weapons. This deception required a performance far more demanding than any battle, a prolonged stillness that would test the very limits of their endurance and their resolve. He then turned to the broader implications of their departure, the deliberate emptying of the Achaean shores. The fleet, he explained, would sail far enough out of sight to be truly gone, only to regroup and return under the cloak of darkness. This strategy, he articulated, relied on the Trojans' own hopes, their yearning for an end to the relentless fighting. He saw the nods of understanding, the flicker of grim anticipation in their eyes. The prospect of a swift, decisive end, however risky, was a siren call to men weary of a decade spent beneath the shadow of impassive walls, a testament to the psychological toll the prolonged conflict had inflicted. Meanwhile, across the churned waters, the city of Troy slumbered under the vast expanse of a star-strewn sky. The sounds of the Achaean camp, once a constant thrum of activity, had faded, leaving an unsettling quiet that settled over the land like a shroud. The Trojans, seeing the deserted beaches and the distant, vanishing sails, felt a hesitant relief bloom in their hearts, a feeling long suppressed by years of watchful vigilance. They began to whisper amongst themselves, their voices carrying on the night breeze, filled with a mixture of disbelief and cautious optimism. The absence of the enemy, so sudden and so complete, seemed almost too good to be true, a break in the relentless cycle of conflict they had endured for so long. Odysseus, observing the meticulous construction of the colossal horse, felt the texture of the raw pine under his calloused hands. He had overseen every detail, from the securing of the hidden access panel to the placement of the oil-slicked runners that would allow its discreet removal from the beach. He thought of the skilled carpenters, their sweat falling onto the wood, their efforts contributing to a deception that would hopefully end this protracted struggle. He also remembered the council meetings, the fierce debates, and the sheer, unyielding persistence that had finally brought the disparate Achaean factions to agree upon this singular, daring plan. He watched as the final touches were added, the skilled artisans working with a precision born of urgency and desperation. The great wooden beast, hollow and imposing, was designed to hold a select contingent of the finest warriors. They would be the instruments of Troy's undoing, emerging from within the city's very embrace once the gates were opened wide in celebration. He felt a prickle of unease, a recognition of the sheer audacity of their plan and the profound danger it represented.
It was a gamble of immense proportions, a testament to the lengths to which men would go when faced with the prospect of an unending war, seeking any path, however treacherous, towards resolution. The scent of freshly worked wood filled the air around the great horse, a smell that was both grounding and unsettling for the soldiers who moved with hushed purpose. Kyle found himself staring at the polished surface, his reflection distorted and unfamiliar, a warrior preparing not for combat but for concealment. He wondered if the gods themselves were watching this elaborate charade, if their favor truly rested upon this ingenious yet terrifying deception. The tension in the camp was a palpable thing, a quiet hum beneath the surface of their outward compliance, as the culmination of years of effort was about to be tested against the defenses of an ancient, proud city. This chapter detailed the intricate planning and construction of the Trojan horse, focusing on the deception and the psychological preparedness of the elite Achaean soldiers chosen for the mission. The plan to infiltrate Troy has been finalized, and the massive wooden horse, the vessel of their clandestine operation, has been constructed and is ready for deployment, leaving the next phase of the audacious deception poised for execution. The dust of the long siege had settled in a fine gray film over everything. For days, the great horse had stood silent on the beach, a hulking, enigmatic monument left behind by the departing Achaean ships. A sense of cautious, almost disbelieving relief permeated the city walls. A merchant, Lycon, adjusted the strap of his laden pack, the usual urgency to reach the market replaced by a hesitant curiosity. He joined a growing throng of citizens moving towards the shore, their faces upturned, scanning the now empty horizon where the enemy's countless sails had once been a constant, oppressive sight. The air, free from the usual tension, carried the faint scent of salt and the distant cries of gulls, a welcome change from the familiar anxieties of the past decade. Lycon felt a prickle of unease, a deep-seated caution ingrained by years of watchful waiting. Yet, the sight of the massive wooden beast, its polished flanks gleaming under the sun, sparked something akin to wonder. Its construction was unlike anything he had ever seen, the planks fitted with a craftsman's precision, a testament to skill that even enemy hands possessed. He heard the excited babble of voices around him, the young men especially, their boisterous calls carrying on the breeze. "A trophy," one shouted, clapping his neighbor on the back. "A victory offering to Athena." Another, a woman with a child clinging to her tunic, offered a silent prayer, her lips moving in a hushed plea. As they drew closer, Lycon could feel the texture of the packed earth beneath his worn sandals, the ground vibrating faintly with the collective movement of so many people. He saw a group of elders at the base of the horse, their brows furrowed in contemplation, their gestures slow and deliberate as they discussed the strange offering. One elder, his beard white as winter snow, spoke of ancient rituals, of appeasing deities with gifts, but his voice lacked conviction. This created a quiet murmur amongst the onlookers, a subtle discordance that Lycon found himself attuned to. He wondered if the very magnitude of the horse might be a trap, a grand illusion cast by a retreating foe. Across the gathered crowd, a different sentiment began to take hold. The sheer audacity of leaving such a monument behind, coupled with the complete absence of the Achaean fleet, persuaded many that the war was truly over. "Look at the craftsmanship," exclaimed a young artisan, running a hand over the smooth, unblemished wood. "Such artistry is a sign of respect, surely." He nudged his friend, his eyes alight with enthusiasm, suggesting they petition the king to bring the magnificent structure into the city. This desire to believe in a peaceful resolution was a powerful force, a longing for normalcy that had been starved for so many years. King Priam, his gaze weary but hopeful, surveyed the scene from the city walls. He saw his people,
their faces transformed from the anxious lines of the siege to expressions of cautious joy and eager anticipation. His advisors offered conflicting counsel, each voice colored by their own experiences and fears. One, a stern military man, argued for reinforcing the walls, for remembering past deceptions, even suggesting they burn the colossal structure where it stood. However, another, a revered priest, spoke of the gods' potential displeasure should they desecrate such a grand votive offering, reminding them of the sacred oaths they had taken to honor divine gifts. Lycon watched as a small contingent of soldiers, acting on the king's hesitant decree, began the laborious process of moving the horse. He observed their strained muscles and the sweat that beaded on their brows as they worked with ropes and rollers, their grunts of exertion echoing across the beach. The sheer effort required to budge the immense weight made him pause and consider the immense resources that must have gone into its creation. This was not a casual undertaking. It was a deliberate, monumental act, leaving him to ponder the true intent behind such a massive display. The procession into the city began, the wooden horse inching its way through the now open gates. The cheers of the crowd grew louder, a wave of collective emotion washing over Lycon. He found himself swept along by the tide of celebration, the skepticism he had felt earlier beginning to recede. He saw families emerge from their homes, children running ahead, their laughter a sound he hadn't realized he'd missed so dearly. For a brief, exhilarating moment, it felt as though the long, dark years of conflict had finally receded, replaced by a bright, hopeful dawn. However, not everyone shared in the unbridled jubilation. Within the royal palace, Cassandra, the king's daughter, her brow furrowed with a sorrow no one seemed to understand, pleaded with her father. Her voice, though filled with an urgency that chilled some listeners, was dismissed by many as the ramblings of madness. She spoke of a hidden danger, of a terrible fate concealed within the gift, her words falling on ears unwilling or unable to hear. Lycon, passing the palace gates, caught a fragment of her distraught cries, a discordant note in the symphony of celebration. He then noticed a group of Trojans, their faces shadowed with a different kind of doubt. These were men and women who had witnessed firsthand the cunning of their adversaries, who had lost loved ones to Achaean raids and stratagems. They exchanged worried glances, their hushed conversations a counterpoint to the general revelry. One man, his arm bound in a rough bandage from a past skirmish, muttered to his neighbor, "This feels too easy. After all this time, why would they simply leave?" Their collective memory of constant vigilance made them inherently suspicious of such a sudden, unexplained departure and its peculiar parting gift. This lingering skepticism was a subtle but significant force, a reminder that the scars of the long siege ran deep. Even as the horse was being positioned within the city, some citizens still hesitated, their hands not quite reaching out to touch the smooth wood, their feet not fully committing to the celebratory dance. The suddenness of the Achaeans' withdrawal, the abandonment of their camps without a final, decisive blow, left a void that suspicion naturally filled. It was a testament to the enduring mistrust that had been cultivated over a decade of war, a deeply ingrained wariness that resisted easy dismissal. As darkness began to fall, the city hummed with an unusual energy. Fires were lit, not for warmth or cooking, but for a grand feast, a celebration of what many believed to be a hard-won peace. Lycon, heading home after a day of trade, paused near the marketplace, the sweet scent of roasted meat and wine mingling with the persistent, faint smell of smoke from distant, abandoned Achaean encampments. He watched as people dance, their movements unburdened by the constant anxiety that had been their companion for so long. Yet, even amidst the revelry, a small part of him, the part that remembered the sharp glint of bronze armor and the taste of fear, remained on guard. In these quiet moments, Lycon could almost forget the weight of the decade-long siege. Night draped itself over Troy like a familiar, welcome cloak, its arrival marked by the fading chatter of the marketplace and the comforting glow of oil lamps in windows. A deep sense of relief had settled upon the city. The Achaean ships, their sails a memory against the distant horizon, had vanished. The colossal wooden horse, a perplexing offering left behind, stood sentinel in the open space before the mighty gates, its polished timbers gleaming faintly. While some citizens felt a cautious hope that the prolonged struggle had finally ended, a persistent unease whispered through the crowds. A young woman, Ilara, a weaver whose hands were accustomed to the gentle rhythm of the loom, felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach as she watched the soldiers celebrating, their boisterous laughter jarring against the quiet plea of her heart for lasting peace. Building upon this widespread relief, yet tinged with lingering suspicion, the sounds within the vast wooden effigy began to stir. Cramped within its hollow belly, a cohort of Achaean soldiers found their patience tested by the close confines. The scent of raw wood mingled with the dampness of their wool tunics, and the faint, persistent odor of their own sweat filled the air, creating a close, almost suffocating atmosphere. They strained to hear the city beyond, the distant revelry a constant reminder of the deception unfolding. A grizzled warrior, Eudorus, felt the familiar weight of his bronze sword hilt in his hand, a comforting anchor in the unnerving silence, and whispered encouragement to the younger men pressed beside him, urging them to remain still and ready. Consequently, as the hours of the night deepened and the city's celebrations reached their zenith, a specific signal, prearranged and subtle, cut through the muffled din. Eudorus, hearing the distant, distinct call of a nightbird, a signal agreed upon by the hidden warriors, felt a surge of adrenaline replace the weariness. He moved with practiced silence, his oiled boots making no sound on the wooden floor, and signaled to his comrades. They began to emerge from their cramped positions, their movements fluid and economical, their faces set with grim determination. The weight of their armor felt familiar, a second skin that spoke of countless skirmishes, but the purpose now was different, cloaked in the deepest secrecy. Therefore, with the wooden horse now a gateway, the Achaean soldiers slipped out into the heart of the sleeping city, their progress unnervingly quiet. They moved through the darkened streets, the rough texture of the cobblestones beneath their sandals a stark contrast to the smooth wood of their temporary prison. Their objective was singular, to reach the city gates and fling them open to the returning Achaean fleet, a force that had strategically withdrawn, lulling Troy into a false sense of security. The torches held by the few Trojan guards on duty cast long, dancing shadows, oblivious to the deadly infiltration happening mere paces away, their watchfulness dulled by the perceived end of hostilities. Furthermore, the Trojan guards, confident in the apparent departure of their enemies, found themselves suddenly overwhelmed. The suddenness of the attack was a shock, the metallic clash of bronze weapons against shields echoing in the narrow passageways. One guard, a young man named Kyle, felt his breath catch in his throat as a shadowy figure disarmed him with surprising speed, the rough grip of the Achaean soldier a chilling sensation. He saw the large gates, usually their bastion of strength, being unbarred from the inside, a traitorous act that sealed Troy's fate. The confusion and terror of the moment were absolute, shattering the night's deceptive calm. Meanwhile, the breaching of the gates signaled the return of the main Achaean army. The sound of thousands of marching feet on the open ground outside the city walls grew from a distant murmur to a thunderous roar. Ilara, roused from a fitful sleep by the sudden clamor, felt a tremor run through the very foundations of her home, a deep, unsettling vibration that spoke of immense force. She pressed her hands against the cool, smooth stones of her window frame, peering out into the night, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a stark premonition of the coming storm settling over her. Consequently, the illusion of peace was irrevocably shattered by the onslaught. The Achaean soldiers, their faces hardened by years of siege, poured into the city, their battle cries filling the air with a terrifying sound. Ilara watched from her window as the familiar streets, usually alive with the gentle hum of daily life, transformed into a scene of chaos and destruction. The scent of burning wood, acrid and stinging, began to drift through the open window, forcing her to cover her nose and mouth, each breath now a painful effort. The sound of shouting and the splintering of wood became a relentless, overwhelming wave. Building upon the utter devastation, a young Achaean soldier, barely more than a boy, found himself swept along in the surge of his comrades. His body, though trained and armored, felt a hollowness within him as he followed orders to push deeper into the city. He saw homes, once filled with warmth and laughter, now being violently invaded. The shouts of his fellow soldiers, once a sound of camaraderie, now carried the brutal weight of conquest. He remembered the long weeks and months spent on the dusty plains outside the walls, and now, within the city itself, the reality of the war's true devastating cost was becoming starkly apparent, an image seared into his mind. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky with streaks of orange and gray, they illuminated a scene of profound loss. The once proud city lay in ruins, its magnificent walls breached, its buildings reduced to smoldering husks. The great wooden horse, now an empty shell, stood as a silent monument to the night's brutal deception. The deep, resonant clang of temple bells, which had once signified peace and celebration, now seemed like a mournful echo of what had been. The triumphant return of the Achaean fleet was a somber affair, the spoils of victory now scattered amidst the ashes of a fallen civilization, the echo of the 10-year struggle forever woven into the fabric of the ravaged land. The great gates of Troy groaned inward, not with the hesitant creak of years of siege, but with the violent shriek of splintering wood. Achaean soldiers, their faces grim and streaked with sweat, surged through the widening gap, their bronze helms glinting in the torchlight that flickered against the stone. A merchant, whose stalls had once overflowed with fine silks and exotic spices from across the sea, clutched a child's hand, his knuckles white against the rough weave of his tunic. He felt the rumble of heavy boots on the familiar cobblestones, a sound that had always meant trade and conversation, now signifying only terror and invasion. This sudden, brutal breach meant that all the carefully managed defenses, the watchful sentries, and the desperate hope of holding out for another season had dissolved in moments. Across the once proud avenues, the sounds of battle erupted, a jarring cacophony of shouts, the clang of metal on metal, and the piercing cries of the wounded. The merchant pulled his family into the shadowed alcove of a baker's shop, its comforting scent of yeast and wood smoke now a poignant reminder of the peace that was so violently ripped away. He watched as Achaean warriors, their movements efficient and brutal, moved through the streets, their purpose chillingly clear as they entered homes and businesses. The sheer number of them, pouring in like a relentless tide, overwhelmed any thought of organized resistance from the civilians, leaving them to the mercy of the invaders. This overwhelming influx marked a terrifying shift from the tense anticipation of the siege to the stark reality of total conquest. A young Achaean soldier, his breath coming in ragged gasps, found himself pushing through a throng of panicked citizens. His shield, bearing the marks of countless skirmishes, felt heavy against his arm, and the smooth, cool metal of his spear was slick with nervous sweat. He had followed the stratagems, listened to the elders' pronouncements, and endured the long years of waiting, all for this moment. However, the raw intensity of the city's final moments was something no amount of planning could fully prepare one for. A chaotic tableau that contrasted sharply with the structured discipline of the Achaean camp. He saw a woman drop a bundle of clay tablets, their cuneiform script scattering across the ground, a quiet testament to the life that had been so thoroughly disrupted.
His commander, a veteran with a scarred brow and a voice like grinding stones, barked orders, his gaze sweeping over the unfolding chaos with practiced efficiency. He pointed towards the royal palace, his intention to secure the heart of the city, a crucial step in solidifying their victory. The young soldier watched as his comrades advanced, their actions driven by a mixture of duty and the raw exhilaration of breaking through the enemy's last defenses. This objective was not merely about claiming territory, but about dismantling the very symbol of Trojan power, a stark consequence of their decade-long struggle. Meanwhile, within the war-torn residential areas, a different kind of desperation took hold. Families torn from their routines scrambled to protect their most precious belongings. A weaver, her hands accustomed to the rhythmic clatter of her loom, now desperately tried to secure a small carved ivory comb, a gift from her late husband, against the encroaching soldiers. She felt the rough wool of her worn chiton snag on a loose stone as she stumbled, her gaze catching the flickering light of a burning building across the street. The personal stakes, the loss of irreplaceable items and cherished memories, formed a stark counterpoint to the grander military objectives. This individual struggle for preservation highlighted the multifaceted devastation of the sacking. The scholarly debate among the ancient thinkers often centered on the extent to which the victors merely plundered and pillaged versus those who sought to preserve or adapt elements of the conquered culture. And the merchant wondered if any part of his city's way of life might somehow endure amidst the destruction. He saw a soldier pause, picking up a lyre from an abandoned courtyard, his fingers tentatively plucking a dissonant chord before tossing it aside. A fleeting moment of curiosity in the tide of conquest. This small, uncharacteristic gesture offered a brief glimpse into the complexities of the attackers, beyond their simple role as destroyers. This wave of destruction was not uniform. It flowed and ebbed, creating pockets of relative calm amidst the raging storm. In one quieter street, a small group of elders sat huddled together, their faces pale and drawn, their conversations hushed and filled with a quiet resignation. One of them, his voice raspy, spoke of ancient prophecies, whispering that such devastation often paved the way for new beginnings, though his words offered little comfort in the immediate terror. The air around them seemed to hold a different quality, a stillness that belied the frantic energy of the nearby fighting, as if life itself was temporarily paused for them. The young soldier found himself momentarily separated from his unit, the disorientation of the battle pressing in. He saw a Trojan woman, her hair unbound and wild, bravely confront an Achaean warrior, not with a weapon, but with a torrent of accusations, spoken in a language he barely understood, her voice ringing with a fierce protective spirit. The warrior, momentarily taken aback by her defiance, eventually pushed past her, his focus drawn by a more significant target. This solitary act of courage, though ultimately unsuccessful, spoke volumes about the spirit of those defending their home. It was a stark reminder of the human cost of such a protracted conflict. He recalled the whispered tales from his childhood, stories of great heroes and their legendary deeds, and now he was a part of such an event, though the reality felt far less glorious and far more brutal.
The camaraderie he shared with his fellow soldiers was forged in shared hardship and the common enemy, a bond that sustained them through the grim realities of war. The sheer scale of the violence was immense, and he felt a pang of weariness, a yearning for the familiar, predictable rhythm of the sea and the open sky, rather than the suffocating embrace of burning buildings. This yearning was a quiet counterpoint to the demands of his current role. As the fighting began to subside in their sector, leaving behind only the acrid smell of smoke and the lingering cries of those in pain, the young soldier leaned against a still-standing stone pillar, its surface cool beneath his sweat-soaked hand. He looked out at the burning city, a sight that marked the end of a long and arduous campaign, and yet it also felt like a beginning, though of what he could not yet fathom. The torchlight cast long, dancing shadows that played across the ravaged streets, a scene of profound desolation. As the first hints of dawn began to paint the sky with pale hues, the young soldier found a moment of quiet amidst the receding chaos. The distant cries of startled birds replaced the roar of battle, providing a strange, muted comfort as he prepared for what came next. The once proud walls of Troy now stood as skeletal remains against a sky the color of bruised plums, their mighty stones tumbled and blackened. A group of Trojan women, their faces etched with a weariness that settled deeper than any physical exhaustion, gathered near the city's shattered western gate. Among them, Ilara, whose hands had once woven the finest wool, now clutched a handful of dry, brittle grass that had somehow pushed through the scorched earth. The persistent scent of wood smoke, a constant companion for years, still clung to the air, a grim reminder of the fires that had consumed their lives. They surveyed the desolate landscape, a familiar panorama of ruin that offered no comfort, only a profound sense of loss that tightened around their chests with each labored breath. The destruction was not merely in the fallen buildings, but in the silence that now reigned where the vibrant sounds of a thriving city had once echoed. Ilara remembered the laughter of children playing near the agora, the rhythmic clang of hammers from the smithies, and the calls of merchants hawking their wares. Now only the mournful cry of a distant bird broke the stillness. Her companion, Lyra, a woman whose resilience had always seemed unyielding, sat on a rough-hewn stone, her gaze fixed on the scorched earth where her home had stood. The smooth, cool feel of the stone beneath her hands offered a fleeting contrast to the rough grief that permeated their existence, a tangible anchor in the overwhelming emptiness.
Meanwhile, on the shores of the Aegean, a different kind of scene unfolded. The Achaean fleet, its sails furled and masts stark against the horizon, prepared for its long journey home. A seasoned sailor named Helen, his skin weathered like old leather, oversaw the loading of amphorae filled with wine and intricately carved wooden chests, the spoils of their hard-won victory. He felt the familiar sturdy timbers of his ship, the sea serpent, beneath his feet, a vessel that had carried him through countless storms, and now, laden with the treasures of a fallen kingdom, promised a return to familiar shores. Yet, as he gazed back at the desolate city, a profound weariness settled upon him, a quiet acknowledgement of the years of fighting and the heavy cost of their triumph. Helen recalled the initial fervor that had driven them across the sea, the shared purpose born from a king's grievance, but that had long since faded, replaced by the grim reality of sustained warfare. He remembered the faces of men lost in skirmishes, the gnawing hunger during long winters spent outside the unyielding walls, and the brutal efficiency of battle. This victory, hard-won and costly, felt less like a celebration and more like the end of a long, arduous task. The memory of the years spent under the harsh sun and the chilling rains, the constant anticipation of battle, and the sheer effort required to simply survive began to feel like a distant, almost unreal dream. Back in Troy,
The women continued their silent inventory of loss. Ilara, her gaze drifting towards the distant peaks of Mount Ida, felt a flicker of the old resentment towards the powers above who seemed to have orchestrated such devastation. She wondered if the gods truly cared for the fate of mortals, or if their games were simply played out on the backs of human lives, leaving only ashes and sorrow in their wake. This question, unvoiced but shared among them, hung in the quiet air, a testament to the enduring human need for meaning even in the face of utter ruin.
The older women, those who remembered Troy before the siege, spoke in hushed tones of the city's former glory, their voices raspy with the dust of destruction. They described the vibrant tapestries that once adorned the palace walls, the scent of jasmine that perfumed the summer evenings, and the lively music that filled the streets during festivals. These memories, shared like precious relics, served as a fragile link to a past that now seemed as distant as the stars, a stark contrast to the present reality of their broken existence. They were the keepers of stories, the ones who had to carry the weight of what was lost. Helen, meanwhile, continued his work, his movements economical and precise. He saw the faces of his crew, some elated by their return, others somber, their eyes reflecting the years of combat. He knew that their stories, when they returned home, would be woven into the fabric of their villages, tales of bravery and loss that would shape future generations. The immense effort required to cross the sea, to build their encampments, and to breach the legendary walls of Troy had demanded an unyielding commitment, a constant adaptation to the harsh realities of siege warfare. He thought about the strategies they had employed, the patience required to wear down their opponents, and the moments of desperate courage that had turned the tide of battles. The logistics of maintaining such a vast army, the constant need for provisions, and the meticulous planning that went into every sortie had been a testament to their collective will. The years spent facing the formidable defenses of Troy had demanded a resilience that tested the very limits of human endurance, pushing them to adapt and overcome every challenge. For the women of Troy, the immediate concern was survival, a struggle that now defined their days. Ilara carefully gathered a few dried roots from the edge of the devastated fields, their meager bounty a stark symbol of their current state. She remembered the abundant harvests of seasons past, the overflowing granaries, and the shared meals that had nourished their community. The memory of such plenty made the present scarcity all the more poignant, a constant gnawing worry that shadowed their every waking moment. Lyra pointed towards a clump of resilient wildflowers that had somehow bloomed amidst the debris, their vibrant colors a defiant splash against the pervasive gray. It was a small thing, a fragile beauty in the midst of utter desolation, yet it sparked a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, she mused, life's persistent force, like these determined blossoms, would eventually find a way to reclaim the scarred earth, offering a new beginning even from the ashes of profound loss. This thought, however tentative, was a precious commodity. Helen, having overseen the final loading of his ship, climbed the gangplank, the wood groaning softly under his weight. He paused at the railing, the familiar scent of brine and tar filling his nostrils, a comforting aroma after so long away. He looked back at the distant silhouette of Troy, a city that had demanded so much and given so much in return. The long, drawn-out struggle, the countless lives lost on both sides, and the sheer determination required to achieve this victory were now etched into his very being, an indelible mark of the years spent engaged in this epic conflict. As the ships began to weigh anchor, a slow, rhythmic procession marking their departure, Helen felt a deep sense of completion, tinged with the inevitable melancholy that follows such a prolonged and devastating undertaking. The grand ambition that had brought them here had been realized. but the cost had been immense, a sacrifice that resonated with the quiet understanding of all who had participated. The memory of the fallen city, its once proud spires now reduced to smoldering ruins, would forever be a part of their journey, a somber reminder of the human cost of ambition and the enduring echoes of conflict. The day's departure had left its mark, but life on the Aegean moved forward, carrying the weight of remembrance with it. As the final embers of our journey through the historic tale of the Trojan War fade, let the quiet of the night embrace you. Imagine the vast Aegean Sea, now calm and still after the storms of battle, reflecting a sky dusted with stars, much like the distant gleam of an ancient city. The decade of struggle, the clash of bronze, the bravery of heroes like Hector and Achilles, all have now settled into the tapestry of time.
The legendary walls of Troy, once defiant, finally yielded, and with their fall, a long era concluded. Now, as you prepare for your own rest, let the enduring human spirit, the resilience, and the longing for peace that echoed through that ancient conflict bring you a sense of profound calm. Drift away, knowing that even the most epic of stories finds its quiet close, and this night, like the end of that momentous war, is a moment for gentle repose. Sleep soundly.